Okay, good evening. Shall we start? Can students attend the lecture while Zoom? Can you confirm with me that you can listen to what I say? Okay, thank you very much. This is the second lecture on the contemporary issue of housing and urban management. So last lecture, I'll give you a very brief introduction about the coverage of this course, particularly when we want to cover both housing and urban management, but perhaps with some kind of emphasis on housing management. But there are some so-called common issues, particularly when we provide services either to housing or to the city. In fact, we have some kind of competing demand about that service, because housing management, to a certain extent, is not some kind of for-profit service. Of course, I mean, some of the setting of housing management may be, but most of the time they perform a special issue of control function. So it's very similar, in fact, in the provision of public services by the city government. So we will concentrate more on this side. And in this lecture, before we go into the discussion of some sort of theme in this course, particularly on involvement, on participation, and we perhaps need to mention a little bit about the context of such sort of management issues, particularly in city and also on housing. Land and housing ownership system is somehow related to how those services are being organized. So later on, when I continue with the so-called the other themes of this course, we will unfold some of those sort of connections. We need to mention that because unlike some common standing, in fact, land and housing ownership system is quite, in some way, unique in Hong Kong and mainland China. Although in other Asian countries, they share similar characteristics. But those land and housing system may not be the same as other Western countries. The bulk of our literature reason from. So that's why we need to make special emphasis on that. Although you may say that on a more macro scales, they are more or less the same, but there are some technical details that will make how the system is organized, how the system is managed in a very different way. So in this lecture, I will basically talk about briefly land ownership system, and in a little bit more details about housing ownership, both in Hong Kong and mainland China. As I mentioned in last lecture, the system are quite the same, because China at the time when it began its economic reform, take heavy reference on the system of Hong Kong. And the system of Hong Kong, in fact, is a variety of similar system in the UK. But in these 150 years, there is a lot of modification on that because of different institutional setup and more because of the geographic setup of the city. And I'll also go into a little bit further into the owners organization, because that will hold the key to our understanding of subsequent lectures about the participation and involvement of owners and residents. So land ownership, of course, land ownership is different in different countries, or sometimes even within a country, the system is the same. The system may not be the same across the country. And Hong Kong, from its very start, has sort of developed a quite unique system, what we call leaseholding. So that have a chain reaction on how housing ownership is being organized. In nearly all countries, of course, with some exception, land are owned by organizations, by individuals. What we call this system a freehold system. Freehold system means that the ownership is permanent. It's permanent. So once you own the land, you can own it forever until you sell it out, or you give to your children, to other people, or otherwise, that what we call private ownership cannot be taken away. But from day one of Hong Kong, in fact, we do not practice such a system. There are some historical and political reasons. For political reason, because most areas of Hong Kong after 1898, in fact, I mean the new territory. The term new territory, in fact, is very colonial because that indicate the colonizers so grab the land and make it new territory. Of course, it's not new. There's been all be part of the Chinese land before that Beijing Treaty was signed. And because the new territory is only sort of obtained by what we call leasing. So for 99 years. So that's why we have the 1997 issue of Hong Kong, because the land is not owned by the British government at that time. So in fact, they have no legal basis to sell freehold of the land. So that's why they cannot have freehold of land in new territory. Of course, before that, between 1842 and 1898, 1898, the lands that have been occupied by the British government in Kowloon and Hong Kong Island, that they should, I mean, at least at that time, for the when the treaty is signed, it should be owned so-called permanently by the British government. But it's paradoxically, at that time, in fact, in 1842 to 43, in fact, starting from that, in fact, the British government want to sell the land to get some revenue for the so-called operation of the British colonial office in Hong Kong. But at that time, it's quite interesting. Nobody wants to buy the land. Nobody wants to buy the land because you will say that if like buying a house, if you buy freehold of a house, it should be quite expensive. But if you just pay the rent of the house, it's relatively cheap. So Hong Kong at that time, in fact, had no worth at all. So no apparent value. So Hong Kong is only used as an entrepot, so that only the merchant who would like to operate in Hong Kong, they have no intention to invest in this place. So that's why when they need the land, they negotiate with the British government that, in fact, they want to just rent the land. So it's under such a political and so-called economic context that freehold of land in Hong Kong is not practiced right from the beginning. So in fact, Hong Kong only have one piece of land that's freehold. Is the I think it's the St. Joseph Church in Central District. So right from the beginning, Hong Kong practiced a leasehold system. Leasehold means that you occupy the land for use with a lease. So you just rent the land for a fixed period. So when you have the land, then you can have the development right of the land. So you can do whatever with the land. Of course, it's subject to other control, which we'll mention subsequently. So for the very first instance, in fact, the lease could be nearly 1,000 years, but it's very exceptional. There were still some sort of lease on Hong Kong Island side, which is close to Central and Sheung Wan, is the first area the British occupy. But subsequently, most of the lease are for 99 years or 75 years. And for the land in that new territory, they all, with the consent of the Chinese government, all the land will be automatically renewed to 2046. So of course, I mean, nobody knows about what will be beyond 2046. And there is an expectation, in fact, there is also a convention that when the lease is expired, they usually will get renewed, of course, with paying a premium. So because you just rent the land with a fixed period. So after the fixed period, you have to rent it again. So that is the usual expectation. But there are also examples that some land will not be renewed. In fact, this happened quite a lot, particularly for commercial land. So in the leasehold system, all the land are owned by the government. So in the colonial era, they call crown land. And after Hong Kong returned to China, it will become so-called government land or state land. But the development right is being granted usually in 3 different ways. One is what we call a public option, and the other is called retendering, and the third is about private contract. Public option, in fact, is the most frequently used way of granting the land development right. So there's all those sort of scenes people will associate with what we call selling the land. So usually it will give for those who have the highest bid. So it's an open and so-called bidding process. So it's called land sale. Although technically it's not correct because you are not selling the land. You are just selling the development right of the land. So the land is only leased for a sort of fixed period. The second is what we call tendering. For some land which has some sort of special use, or the government wants the land to have some kind of special function. So I mean public function. So they will not just sort of sell the land in public option, but they invite the developer to submit a tender to bid for the land. So when it's tender, usually, but of course not all the cases, they will consider not just price, but special requirement. So usually they will divide up the tender assessment into 2 components. One is about price, and the other is about technical specification. So that is what we call a 2-envelope system. So you have to fill in your tender in 2 different envelopes. And the two envelopes are being assessed by 2 separate and independent committees within the government. So each will make an independent assessment. So, and they also have a predetermined proportion in terms of the assessment. So that price specification and technical specification can be equally so important. And for some cases, they set an order for those assessments. So they will assess the technical specification first to see whether the bidder have fulfilled the requirement of the government, or they will choose the bidder with the sort of best proposal to fulfill those technical specifications. Later on, I'll give some information on that. So you may be excluding some bidder because they do not fulfill the technical specification. For those who fulfill that, they will open up the second envelope about price. So then, usually it's the highest bidder will get the land. So the system operates in such a way. Take for example, we have the cruise terminal, we have the West Kowloon Cultural District, so being developed in such a way. Although in this process, I think these two examples, because in the process, there are a lot of so-called changes and fiasco about this tendering. Because either the technical specification, for instance, about the cruise terminal have not been fulfilled, so nobody is being selected, and then the government at the end choose to construct the terminal by itself. Whereas the Western cultural area, they undergo very different or several changes in plan. So first they have a plan that will award the whole area to a single bidder. But later on, because of some political and economic reasons, they turn it down. And then we do it again. So that is why the West Kowloon Cultural District have been delayed for so long. I think it's delayed for about nearly 15 years. The third is about contract. So the land is being leased to the developer by private contract without involving option or involving tendering. These are exceptional cases. So in the history of Hong Kong, there are not too many such examples. They do that because if the land have some designated use, that in the market, in fact, very few or only one or two developer will possess such eligibility. So even for option and tender, it will not increase competition because the competitors are not that many. So sometimes it's just one. Or very often, they have a very specific target of developer in mind, in fact, to begin with. We do not have that many examples. Perhaps the example we were able to call are the Disneyland and the Cyberport. Disneyland is something obvious. You want to develop Disney, so you have Disneyland, you have to negotiate with Disney. And unless you want to have other plan, for instance, Universal Studio, and then you will negotiate with Universal Studio on that. Cyberport is a little bit controversial. So there's a story behind that. So perhaps the time is too soon on that because it too limited for me to have a detailed explanation on that. And so that is also one of the biggest controversy in the history of land lease in Hong Kong because of the Cyberport. Because this Cyberport, in fact, began with a proposal from Richard Lee, the son of Lee Ka-shing, to the Hong Kong government to develop a hub for technological innovation. So there's a Cyberport. But when a big piece of land is being awarded to the company, it turned out to be most of the areas have been developed into a upmarket residential project. So that is something that creates outcry from the society. So that's why subsequent plan of this, the government have been extremely cautious. When the developer get the land from the government, they need also to fulfill different kind of control, what we call development control. So the condition set by the government. And this whole set of control would only apply for new acquisition of land, or when you need to renew the lease of the land. So that the land lease is a very important control instrument of the Hong Kong government in urban development. And of course, also include housing. So usually those development, whatever is residential, commercial, or other, they need to fulfill at least 4 types of control. One, we call it a planning control, and the other, if it involves some kind of building, so it will involve the building control. And more recently, there are also environmental control on that. But more important, in fact, is the use of the land lease as an instrument to create infrastructure. So that is what we call the lease control. Planning control are nearly the same in every cities and any developed country. So we have urban planning, so that we have zoning, and we also have a lot of that control about what and how you can develop the land. So in Hong Kong, the planning control is being exercised by the Town Planning Board. And the Town Planning Board is supported by the Planning Department as an administrative arm that serves the Town Planning Board. So the Town Planning Board is responsible to develop the what we call the strategic plan of the city, and also to specify the zoning of the land. So I mean the piece of land and what kind of sort of planning intention it is. And the British planning system is a little bit special. So it's not the same as continental Europe, but even compared with the US, they have a slightly different system. So in Hong Kong, in fact, the zoning or the purpose of land use is being specified, and this is stated in law. But there are also some clauses in, not hidden, but in the appendix of those so-called planning law that will allow the Town Planning Board to have some discretion so that you can have some flexibility in developing the land, So usually in the planning control is about land use zoning. So when the piece of land is being stated as residential, commercial, or industrial, leisure, government, green area, so there's some kind of intention that the land is being used in such a way. But those land use zoning can be changed in some circumstances. But how they can be changed and changed from what to what is something a little bit technical. So that's why those developers who are fluent in those town planning law and processes usually will get some advantage on that. So every now and then when you read the news in Hong Kong about the developer applying for some kind of change in land use, some succeed and some not, and there's a lot of factors that have been involved, and that in fact worth a independent research on that. Besides the intention of land use, you also would have what we call the site coverage. So how you cover the site with so-called buildings and other infrastructure. And more recently, in fact, some districts have been imposed what we call the building height, which about a decade ago is non-existent in most of the districts. But now the Town Planning Board is doing district by district to setting the building height. because all the so-called social comments on either being too high or the building is obstructing some kind of so-called what we call the landscape. The most important, and in fact, one very, very essential instrument for the government to control development density is about plot ratio. I briefly explained in last lecture what is plot ratio for those who are not familiar with that. But of course, I mean, for students in urban planning or involved in housing management, they are very, very sensitive to the plot ratio, particularly when you work for the developer, because it will depend, it will dictate how much you can build, that is how much you can sell and make and generate profit. So it's about the density of development. So with a fixed so-called GFA, if you build high, the building will cover less land so that it will allow for more open space. Every plot of land can have a different plot ratio. It depends on the land needs. Some are historical and some because of the sort of later planning restrictions. So usually in the rural area, it's only 0.4. And 0.4 also apply to some areas in the urban district as well. Take for example in Kowloon Tong, you see a lot of very so-called low buildings, 3 or 4 story high, and they have extremely so-called low plot ratio. Whereas the highest is in Hong Kong Island because of the old lease and also because of the need in increasing the density of development. So the plot ratio of 7.5, 9, 12, or even 15 is not uncommon in those areas. But there's a difference. If you develop residential building, usually the plot ratio is lower. If you develop commercial building for offices, you probably can get a higher so-called plot ratio. When you get the land, when you have the when you have fulfilled all those so-called planning requirements, if you want to build a building, there is also a building control, which is exercised by the building department of Hong Kong. So your very detailed building plan has to be approved, and the building department will control this part, whereas whether you fulfill the gross floor space is controlled by the land department, who's responsible to granting the land lease. And all your building facilities on safety, on fire, on water supply, they're being monitored by relevant government department on that. So there is a very, very detailed building code you need to adhere to. And in different parts, you have very elaborated so-called condition. So that is why if you develop a building in Hong Kong, if you build it from scratch, so it involves quite a long time. So even for public housing, usually you will need about 5 to 6 or even 7 years to develop a building, from you getting the land to the completion of the building. Whereas for private development is not much shorter. 5 to 6 years is usually the norm for such development because of all kinds of control that has to be implemented in sequence. The leasehold system of Hong Kong also equipped the Hong Kong government with a very significant and sometimes essential instrument for urban development, particularly about the development of urban infrastructure. This kind of lease control is not too common in other countries because Hong Kong have the advantage of leaseholding. So when you have leaseholding, so leaseholding is just like a contract. Sorry, I think somebody have to turn off your volume. Because it's a private contract. So the government can make specification with the other side who make the contract to install additional so-called infrastructure. In other cities, that is also possible, but they have to do it in a indirect and more complicated way. Take, for example, if I want to install some open space in the urban area, when there is a piece of land that is available, and the government can require the developer to set aside some area for open leisure space that is open to the public. So you may see that even in old districts in Hong Kong, occasionally there are some small plot of open space. And later on, I'll also show that sometimes the open space become very obscure. Because if the developer do not want to do that, they cannot get the land lease because it's part of the condition of the land lease. Whereas in another city, if you want to create that, but you cannot use this instrument because lands are already owned by private. So any exchange of the ownership of the land would not involve the government. So the government, in fact, cannot insert those clauses in the contract. Whereas in Hong Kong, even for land that have been acquired by developer in the past, so unless they do not change the lease condition, otherwise, when you apply for the change of the lease condition, it's just like creating a new lease. So the government can insert any terms into that land lease. But the developer, usually, even the developer, they don't want to do that. They have no choice because with the existing lease, usually they won't have any profit. You can imagine. If I have a piece of land that's already being so-called fully used. So if I adhere to the old lease condition, or perhaps I can only build something that are very similar to the existing building. So where can you get a profit? You need to demolish the old building, you need to build a new building, and then there's all costs. So usually they need to negotiate with the government in renewing the so-called lease. So that's why in some urban area, there's still possible to insert some infrastructure on that. So the government have complete freedom, in fact, if this land is fresh. So this is very, very popular in Hong Kong. So in the build-up area, usually they will require the developer to create some open space or to create some open access for pedestrian. For bigger development, in fact, they even will require the developer to install public facilities like footbridge, like some subway for pedestrians, public toilets, even public transportation terminal, or even schools and roads. Or you can name them. But of course, this will be translated into the reduction of the premium for the land lease, because the developer need to make profit. So whatever they spend on those public facilities, that happen to be deducted in the land premium. So financially, in fact, the government may not gain, but the government would gain on efficiency and on time. Because otherwise, if the government have to be involved in the development of such facility, and the coordination can be complicated, So that's why you can see a lot of those so-called additional infrastructure. But sometimes those infrastructure, they are being proposed by the developer to enhance the accessibility of the development. Take for example, on top of the Mongkok station, there is the Grand Century so-called office tower, and also the shopping mall Moco. And from there is a very long footbridge leading to Mongkok. And in fact, part of that was a suggestion of the developer. And part of those footbridge are sort of the costs are being borne by the developer. So in fact, in Kowloon Bay, some years ago, a few developers is basically led by the developer Kerry, want to develop a series of footbridge linking the commercial building in Kowloon Bay with the Kowloon Bay station, MTR station. And they have a very detailed plan, and also they have a cost as well. The government initially agreed to that, but because that will enhance the value of their property, and the footbridge, in fact, would be occupying public land, the government land. So the government demand the payment of an extra land premium to allow them to build on the public land. And the sum is quite substantial. I think it's in the scale of tens of millions. I'm not quite sure about the amount. It may be about 40 to 50 million on that. And of course, the developer would not concede, because they will say that I'm contributing to the public good of making accessibility or the pedestrian flow more convenient. But of course, the land department will think otherwise. So it shouldn't be, although the developers agree to bear the cost of construction, but because of the principle of the land department that anything that will enhance your land value, the extra value should go to the public. So that's why they command the payment of extra land premium on that, because that may be fair, because they have to occupy the public land across the roads, and these are public lands. So in many of such development, you usually, sometimes initiated by the developer, particularly when a new building is being built near the MTR station, or an new MTR station is being developed close to their building. Usually they will also apply for opening up an entrance to the MTR station. And of course, the cost is borne by the developer. And I'm not quite sure whether they have to pay extra land premium, but even if they have to, the amount would be sort of quite small. But very often is upon the request of the government stated in the land lease that will ask the developer to install some public facility. The usual public facility is something like the festival walk, that they need to allow public access from the MTR station to some kind of so-called exit to the outside of the building. So they have to set a condition that those pathways have to be sort of open for a certain hours in the day. Particularly, for instance, that will concern us because an important entrance to CDU has to go through Festival Walk. So that's why the Festival Walk cannot block the or to deny the entrance of people who just want to go to CDU. And that is very, very common in most of the MTR stations, particularly when those MTR stations are being directed to the shopping mall and you have no other choice, even if you do not want to go into the shopping mall, because that is the only route you can go outside. So there are a lot of such examples. For instance, in the Sha Tin station of Newtown Plaza, there's also such a rule. So there are numerous such examples. And these are all being laid down in the land lease as a land lease condition. But more interestingly and more controversial is about some land lease. They require the developer to provide public open space as part of the development. So these are the public space on private land, because the land has already been leased to the private developer, so they're private. But a small proportion of the private land is required by the land lease to act as sort of public space. So of course, the private developer is very reluctant to do that. So what they have done, there are numerous also examples as well. So that has been quite controversial in some development. So they are required to have an open public space of a certain area and with a certain opening hours. So in fact, some, not all, some of the private developer, they will do is to set that public open space on the podium of the development, because most of our big residential projects, they have a podium. So they set it on the podium, which is easily accessed by the residents, but very difficult to access by general public from outside. There are some examples, for instance, one in Tai Kok Tsui is on the 7th floor. Of course, the residents can take a lift to that, but the outside residents, they have to walk 7 stories to the open space. Of course, they are abiding to the lease condition of providing that space and also that opening hour. But it turns out no people from the general public have the interest to go there. So that is becoming a public-private space because only the residents will be more convenient to enjoy. So for some such projects, they end up in this way. And at that time, it creates a lot of sort of public outcry on that. The fourth is about environmental control. Environmental control, compared with the other 3 types of control, is relatively new because of concern for environmental protection. So usually when building is concerned, is more on the emission during construction and about the prevention of noise. So some such control are being implemented by the government to build those shelters to reduce the noise level. And more recently, in many residential development, when they are facing some so-called noisy sources, take for example, highway or railways, in terms of building design and installation, they are required to install something to reduce the noise level. So it adds to the complexity of design and sometimes the inconvenience of the residents. Connecting to the land system, in fact, is quite our not unique, but popularity of some kind of housing ownership. I mentioned briefly last lecture that in fact, in most countries, housing ownerships exist in the form of single-family housing. So a family bought a piece of land and they build a house, and then they occupy the house and also the land. So usually the land plus the house are owned by a single family. So you may say that that is simple. That is simple. When there is a need to have a multi-family housings, usually they will not be multi-owned. It's owned by the single owner, but rented to the tenant. Because in terms of the ownership, in terms of the responsibility, is perhaps the simplest. And that is also the case, in fact, in Hong Kong before the 1960s. So when you are from Hong Kong and born and raised in Hong Kong, even if you are not old enough, sometimes your seniors will tell you that in the 50s, when you want to buy a house, you cannot just buy a unit. You have to buy the whole building. Or in Cantonese, we will say that you buy a number, because you only have a number of the street, but not the floor. So you need to buy a number. So it's about number 5 Castle Pit Road. So there's the building with that sort of address of the number. Because there is no legal or practical arrangement to arrange to sell the individual unit in a proper way. So in the 50s, in fact, most of the families in Hong Kong, they are just tenants because they cannot afford to buy. Those who afford to buy, in fact, how can you live so-called 5 or 10 units when you have to bought the whole building? So usually they will occupy 1 unit and then they will rent the rest of the unit to others. But occasionally, maybe you have friends, you have families who bought the whole building and then they divided it up. So at that time, in fact, those transactions in the 50s and the 60s, when you want to buy or sell a single unit, it involves the rest of the owners. I did a research on urban renewal in Century POL and look at all those sort of property transactions in the past. And some transactions are very, very complicated because when a unit is being sold, it involves all the rest of the owner to sign the contract because they have to consent to selling the unit because they own it collectively. So that is not a convenient way. So that's why the organization of ownership in multifamily housing needs some kind of modification in order to make those transactions easy and also legally valid. There are several ways that we can organize the ownership of those multifamily housing. And this perhaps may be related to why we need to so-called build multifamily housing. But of course, the simplest consideration is about economic. A single house will occupy a piece of land. And when land is being purchased because of the demand for that land, it will drive up the price. So one way of reducing the cost of housing is to build high so that you can share the cost of the land. So these are the economic motivation of developing multifamily housing. But some countries, they develop multifamily housing not because of economic motivation. Take, for example, some Scandinavian country like Sweden or Norway, they develop multifamily housing because they want to keep the community as close as possible. Because if you have some experience living or traveling in some Western country which have a low density of development, take, for example, some small city in the UK, most of the city in the US and Canada and Australia, except with the exception you stay in the city center of big cities, the development density is very, very low. When the population density is so low, the provision of public services will not be efficient. So in the US, if you want to use public transport, in most cities, it's extremely inconvenient. You have to walk 50 minutes to the bus station, and the bus is so infrequent, you have to wait for half an hour on that. That is also the case even in Europe when the public services is subsidized. Not to say public facility like parks, swimming pools, or public gymnasiums, you need a critical mass to support those public services. So usually in the US, you have to drive to most of those facilities. You cannot walk, or not even on a bike because it's so far away. So that's why in those countries, in those cities, public services is not that well developed. So for instance, in Sweden, if they want to have an efficient public services, you need to increase the population density so that the residents can just walk or a short trip on a bike, and then you can access the public facilities. So what they do is to build multifamily housing. So you can imagine that a country as big as Sweden only have about 10 million people. They do not have to build high. But in most Swedish cities, single family housing is not the norm. Of course, I mean, they will not build 20 or 30 story, but at least it's 5 or 6 or 7 story high, and they all sort of live together. Not just because of the provision of public services, because you can have higher population density that is positive to the creation of community cohesion, because people are living close to each other. It's easier to build a community around that building. But of course, in some cities, it could be just a constraint of geography. Hong Kong is perhaps the combination of the constraint of geography and economy. Because land why land is so expensive in Hong Kong, because lands that are suitable for development is in short supply because of the topology of the city. So most of our lands from the beginning was hilly or in small islands, which is not suitable for development. So we need to create land from reclaiming from the sea, and also build very expensive communication link between different sort of spots or build-up areas. So that's why it constrains the use of a land. So in fact, 90% of the population of Hong Kong is just occupying about 10% of the land. Whereas in the other 90% of the land, either it is of environmental sort of sensitive areas, I mean, that is consideration recently, but in more distant time, because of the expensive cost in developing transportation link and to clear the land for development. And the different rationale underlying the development of multifamily housing will lead to the creation of different forms of housing ownership. So there are sort of four forms of multifamily ownership that we can trace. One is about co-ownership, the other is about leaseholding. Leaseholding is on the same principle as the leaseholding of land, but it's the leaseholding of housing. And we also can develop cooperative or condominium. I won't go into detail of that because in a subsequent lecture about the institutional setup, we will discuss more about those technical details of that. And next, we'll go to describe the owners' organization as a result of those sort of collective ownership. But before that, let us take a break of 10 minutes. Can you come back again at 7:40?
I have a question. There are three of us. We are from China. We are from the urban stream, and we found that we are in PDP now, and we found that it's housing topic. And in the list, we find we are from B2, 4 to 6. There are only three of us. I wonder if that is a mistake.
I'm not quite sure because dividing up is not random. I think they have some kind of principle. But well, as long as you are in the same course, it may not be a big issue. I think it's maybe because of the balancing of the group size.
There are only three of us. Also, the other of the urban stream, they are all the urban topics.
No, because we also have housing and urban topic. I mean, the housing student has also to do some topic on not housing. So I think that it's fair to a different group of students.
Okay. So there are
not a mistake. Not a mistake. I think they will group students with similar background together.
Right.
But also because they also want to have a balance of group size. Or otherwise, I mean, if you are being transferred to another group, if the group is too big, it may not be too good for your learning.
I also realize that the plantation, there are 4 parts. And they are not all urban or all housing.
Yeah. So I think that's fair to both students with a different background. So unless you find it very difficult, I didn't see any difficulties on that. No, that's not an error. I don't think it's an error. So you are from urban management, but because we also have a student from urban planning. So I think they have they have to do the same.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, let's continue. Well, before the break, I mentioned that in multifamily housing and in multi-owned housing, there is substantial sharing of facilities and utilities. And it also involves some form of collective ownership. I'll delay the more detailed explanation to a subsequent lecture when we describe the institutional setup of those multifamily housing. So in this lecture, perhaps I will first describe the owners' organization in Hong Kong, some factual information, and then later on, those institutional setup in mainland China. They are very similar. So I first perhaps I will explain it with the Hong Kong example first. We need sharings of facilities and utilities and some form of collective ownership. So individual owner cannot make a decision, in fact, if there is not an organization that represents the owner. So accept this simple explanation first. Later on, in subsequent lecture, when we describe the institutional setup in more detail, you may have a better understanding of why we need that. Whereas, because of that, we need a collective organization on that. And in Hong Kong, we call it a owners corporation. So the owners of multifamily housing, they will form an owners corporation, and then the owners corporation, they will elect a management committee to bear the daily operation of the owners corporation. And the owners corporation will appoint a management agent on that, where this management agent is being supervised by the management committee. So for those who are involved in housing management in Hong Kong, they're very familiar with this kind of arrangement. And there is an internal constitution, what we call the deed of mutual confidence, that will govern how the owners corporation is being operated. And part of those owners those DMC, they need to comply with the law that govern the formation and then the operation of owners corporation, the building management ordinance. So later on, we also show that, in fact, the building management ordinance is not at all a law on building management. Of course, it's on building management, but more, it provides a legal foundation for the establishment of owners corporation. So if you do not have an owners corporation, or you do not appoint a management agent, in fact, the building management ordinance would have little to do with you. Of course, not completely. You can completely get around with the building management committee, but most clauses in the building management ordinance will not apply to you. So that is something very paradoxical. And that is also the inadequacy of what we call the law on building management in Hong Kong, unlike in other countries. Even compared with the law in mainland China, the law on building management in Hong Kong is quite inadequate in this sense. Later on, we may have the chance to explain in a little bit more details. So the owners corporation is being established, which is mirrored on a company, in fact. It's close in the structure of the company. But it's not a company, because they do not have to register with the company registry. They register with the land registry. So it's associated with the land and the building. And in Hong Kong, the formation is not mandatory. But once the owners corporation is being formed, regardless whether you agree to it or not, you are automatically listed as a member. And the decision of the owners corporation will be compulsory to all the owners within the development. So that is also something very special, unlike in a private company. In a private company, you will not be automatically listed as a shareholder. If you are not the shareholder, the companies, all the activity of the company will not apply to you. But in this multi-owned building, that is different. And in fact, owners corporation do not just exist in residential building. In fact, in any kind of multiple ownership, you can form owners corporation. Industrial building, commercial building, offices, shopping center, if they have all the individual owners, they are also eligible for owners corporation. So it's not restricted to residential. So I just said that the building management ordinance is a special law for the setup and operation of the owners corporation, but it's not at all a comprehensive law on building management. Because many of the regulation, how you manage your building, in fact, is scattered in sort of different law. If there is water supply, there is law on water supply. When there is electricity, there are law on electricity. When there is a noise control, there is an environmental protection law. And if there's about lift, there is also another legislation on lifts. So there is a lot of other so-called regulation on how you manage the building. Whereas in fact, the building management ordinance, as its name suggests, play the least important part in building management. So unless you form your owners corporation or you have appointed a management agent, or otherwise, many of the clauses within the building management ordinance will not apply to you. So that's why we said that those buildings without owners organization, without management agent, what we call the free no buildings, they are the most difficult to manage because of our inadequacy in the law. In Hong Kong, when you want to set up your owners corporation, you need to have at least 30% of the consents of the owners proposing that. But there's some leeway in the law because of gathering 30% of all the shares very often is very difficult. So under some circumstances, the Home Affairs Department, the government department that oversees all those owners corporation, they can approve the formation of owners corporation just with 20% of the share of the development. And sorry, it's about the typo. If it is the order of the law, you can even reduce the proportion to 10%. Sorry, it's not 20%. The deed of mutual confidence in Hong Kong is regarded as a private contract. And it's also paradoxical because it is an internal constitution governing the operation of the owners corporation and also dictating what residents, users, or other people related to the buildings have to be observed. But the DMC, in fact, was being drafted by the developer. And because this is regarded as a private contract, so that the change in any of the clauses under the common law, the principle of common law, have to get consent from all those stakeholders in that so-called contract. So that is 100% consent of all the owners. So in fact, it proved to be extremely difficult. It is, if not impossible. But one thing is very important in the DMC is about the land grant conditions. So that's in the interest of the government to ensure that all land grant condition is being written down in the DMC so that subsequent buyers have to be abiding to these conditions. So perhaps that is the only sort of special thing about the DMC. When the majority of the residential development cannot form an owners corporation, some kind of supplementary organization is allowed. So the development can form an owners committee which have no decision-making power or no ownership right, but they are legitimate to give advice to the management agent. But the owners committee have to be formed when there is there is a provision in the DMC. So because that is some kind of institutional, internal institution. For some older buildings, even owners committee cannot be formed because the DMC doesn't have that clause. They will replace it, some function will be replaced by what we call the mutual aid committee. These are committees that are established by the Home Affairs Department simply for the coordination among residents. And now there is also a rumor, not a rumor, because it's a concrete plan for the government to phase out those mutual aid committees. So in fact, in most of the residential building, unless they're very old building, or in the public housing estates, the mutual aid committees are not that popular. Whereas in China, the land and the housing ownership system is similar to that in Hong Kong. I've just mentioned repeatedly that when the system was developed, they take heavy reference on the Hong Kong system, because the leasehold system would match seamlessly with the socialist so-called system, political system of China, whereas all production resources, including land and housing, are being owned by the state. Whereas in the economic reform, it introduced private property and commodity housing. For a very long time, the ownership have not been stated legally either in the Constitution or in concrete laws. So when they introduced the leasehold system, in fact, it offered a very, very good transition for that, because land is still owned by the state. So similar to Hong Kong, but people seem to have private ownership of the house because they have the leasehold right, also for a fixed period. So in China, it's usually residential is 70 years, industrial 50 years, and commercial 40 years. So in fact, Shenzhen was the earliest of the cities that introduced the system the earliest. So in fact, some of the commercial land, they are due to expire its lease. So that is something that they need to do to renew the lease. So in fact, until 2007, when the real right law is being enacted, there is no legal protection for private property right. Although the Constitution have changed in a way that it respects and protects private interests in properties. And under the real right law, the occupants of the land would have some kind of expectation on automatic renewal of the leasehold right. Although the law doesn't specify how it's being done or what kind of premium they have to pay, because there's still no precedence on that renewal. In housing management, in fact, it's also similar to Hong Kong, because it was in the early 80s, Shenzhen also imported the system of property management from Hong Kong to Shenzhen. So the first property management company was set up in Shenzhen. The first owners committee was also set up in Shenzhen. And they also set up the first property management company trade association to allow the government to coordinate different property management company in the city, so as to streamline the practice of property management. And also the first property management law was also enacted in Shenzhen, which is later on being modified and become the national law. So I won't go into detail of that. Whereas, because China also implement a condominium system, which will require all multi-family, multi-owned development to form their homeowners organization in order to realize the collective ownership and also to exercise the collective management right. So in cities in China, homeowners can form their homeowners assembly, which is equivalent to the owners corporation in Hong Kong, although legally speaking, they are not equivalent, because of the legal status of the organization in China is not that clear. There is a lot of confusion on that. So the owners assembly is not an organization because they are not being registered as an organization, unlike in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is quite explicit. You register the owners corporation, whereas the owners corporation will appoint a management committee. Whereas in China, the owners assembly will elect a homeowners committee. And in China, technically speaking, it's the homeowners committee who need to register, not the organization, but the homeowners committee. So that is something, so a difference, and also will create some kind of confusion and contradiction. And that is equivalent to the management committee of Hong Kong. But in China, the property management law will also entrust the residence committee to have the right of supervision of the homeowners committee. For those who are not familiar with that, let me withhold it a little bit, because in a subsequent lecture, I'll explain more in detail. There is an pseudo state organization, which is not part of the so-called state mechanism, but they are being funded by the local state, and also being so-called supervised and controlled by the local state. So there is a direct intervention of the local state into the owners committee, or the operation of management of the community. So there's no equivalent in Hong Kong. And the owners assembly will appoint a property management agent in that. But there are also some difference in terms of the organization and implementation about managing the neighborhood between Hong Kong and mainland China. Take, for example, on decision making. Hong Kong requires a physical meeting on that. Although in the physical meeting, you can also have proxy. So under the property management law of China, physical meeting is explicitly mentioned. And they also will allow proxy. But in practice, how the owners assembly exercise those meetings and voting, what we call the balloting, take various forms. Some are not so exactly legal, but they're in some kind of gray area. So there's a lot of those so-called practice. But one thing that is different in mainland Chinese cities is they have also the internal so-called constitution. They call it the residence contract. And that residence contract can be changed, Of course, with some supermajority, but at least there's a mechanism that you can change. You do not require 100% consent of all the owners. The other different thing between Hong Kong and China is about the convention in the charging system. One thing quite specific in China, although it's not unique in China, in many other countries, when there is an explicit popularity in the condominium type of multifamily housing, usually the government will require the setup of some sinking fund. So whereas in China, the sinking fund is almost sort of mandatory. And they come from the contribution of the developer to set aside some money to that. Of course, sinking fund is also not new in Hong Kong, but that is voluntary. So many big development, they also set up some sinking fund. Usually it's by the sort of gradual saving from the management fee to set up a sinking fund. Sinking fund is a fund that is used for major repay maintenance, so that the residents do not have to contribute a large sum because of that. So they make some gradual saving in Hong Kong, whereas in China, it's basically from the developers, sort of transfer of fund to the owners committee. One, the routine so-called charging of property management in China is quite different. Although under the property management law, there are two types of charging system that have been mentioned. One is a system, what we call the management remuneration system, which is a extremely popular sort of charging system in Hong Kong, so that the management agent will levy a fixed proportion of the total management outgoing of the property as their remuneration. And that expenses within the development will include all direct and indirect costs. So we may say that the management remuneration is the pure profit of the property management company. Of course, I mean, they can have other outgoing about promotion, about marketing. I mean, that is extra that you cannot charge the projects. Or otherwise, all indirect costs can charge the projects. And whether the residential project generate profit or money losing have nothing to do with the property management company. They get a fixed profit margin of that. Whereas in China, in the property management law, there's another, what we call all-inclusive system being mentioned. So it's just like running an ordinary business. You charge a fixed amount for your customer, and you agree under the contract to provide certain type of services at certain quality of provision. So whether you can make a profit or making a loss is completely depend on how skillful you are in manipulating the provision and saving your cost of provision. So it's just like a business. So these two systems are very, very different. But of course, both have is sort of advantage and disadvantage. One additional sort of complication in the operation of the charging system is the level of property management fee is still being monitored by the City Price Bureau. So the Price Bureau is not just set up to monitor the property management fee, is an bureau that will oversee all prices that are related to people's livelihood. Because of that restriction, any change, of course, is basically increase in the property management fees have to get approval from the Price Bureau, which in some cities is very, very difficult. So in many cities, in fact, the level of property management fee have not been raised for quite a long time, Disregard, the minimum wage in the cities have increased several times over the decades. So these complications, in fact, together with the all-inclusive operation mode, create a lot of so-called conflict between the property management agents and the residents. So in the last about 20 years, I've been researching on property management in mainland China. And I've interviewed numerous sort of property management agents, companies in many cities. Basically, it's the big cities. And they usually hold a view or express that they cannot make profit from those operations. Even if they're able to make a profit, the profit margin is very thin. Of course, I mean, that is what we are told. But perhaps for those who have interest in the development of property management in China, you realize that in recent years, in the recent about 5 to 6 years, a lot of property management companies are being listed in the stock market. And they reveal that they make a very handsome profit. So I mean, that is something that interests me. So I'm not quite sure how they make their profit, but perhaps some of the profit may be in the gray area, or in some way on the expenses of the right of ownership and management of the owners. So in later lecture, I'll return to maybe to these themes you have the interest. But that is adding all of that, it creates some kind of very special ecology, not just in property management, but in managing the neighborhood, as I mentioned in the last lecture of introduction. So it's not just managing housing, it's about how the state involved in managing the residential projects and how the owners will perceive and exercise their right of ownership and management, which create some gap, but also at the same time create a lot of contradiction. So similar to Hong Kong, in fact, the setup rate of the owners committee has been very low in most cities. And perhaps with the exception of Shanghai. Shanghai claims to have close to 90% of setup rate. I did research on these areas in Shanghai in the last 15 years. In fact, what they said about setup rate is high because many, if not all, those owners committee, they are being set up by the local government. So the setup rate is very high. But that would, on the other hand, make the governance of the residential neighborhood more efficient, when, of course, from the eyes of the local government. Whereas in other other cities, because of the setup rate is so low, the government have extreme headache in improving the services to those communities, particularly for the old communities. And to overcome this low setup rate, there are different solutions to that, which we also mention in subsequent lecture, what we call the Clubwood model. But this would have a very weak legal status in China. And that is also one area that will create a lot of contradiction and controversies. And more important, in the context of mainland China cities, there are a lot of power imbalance. Although power imbalance is a common theme in most of the countries that have condominium system. In the UK, in Ireland, in China, in North America, in Canada, there's a lot of this sort of power imbalance because of the management agents who will usually hold information that create some kind of advantage in the exercise of power. And also how the law is being drafted and being implemented, they will also give advantage to the developers and the management agent. Because the developer and the management agents are easier to control from the eye of the government. And in this respect, they are also more quote unquote trustworthy. They're more reliable. Whereas residents are not that reliable in terms of managing so-called their neighborhood. So in China, that power imbalance not just involve the property management agent, but also involve the local government. So that makes it complicated. So perhaps I stop here and see whether you have any question on that. To give a very short summary, in fact, I have described the land ownership, particularly about leaseholding, which will facilitate, in fact, the setup of multifamily ownership and the condominium system. Without the leasehold so land ownership, multifamily housing is still viable, but it may not be that seamlessly integrated with city development, particularly about the development of infrastructure and community facilities. And because of that, you need an owners organization to realize the collective ownership right and to exercise the collective management right of the owners. Because you can imagine that in a property of 100 or a few thousand owners, it's very, very difficult to have the collective effort of all those who are involved to contribute to the collective management. And you need a lot of supporting institution and rules in doing that. And Hong Kong has set up a system of owners cooperation in implementing those collective rights and ownership. China have something similar in terms of institutional setup. But in terms of its implementation, there are some differences. In Hong Kong, the owners cooperation are not very popular because many residential development, they are unable to set up their owners cooperation. And the situation is similar in China. And power imbalance is also exists both in Hong Kong, in other countries that have the condominium system, and of course also in mainland China. Cities in mainland China, the power imbalance is exacerbated because of the involvement of the local government, particularly of the mission of the local government to have a tight control in terms of social activities. So with that, in next lecture, we will enter into a theme, what we call collective action dynamic, because of the need to have collective ownership, collective effort in management, and in the general theories, we call it collective action. And every collective action, in fact, according to the theories, has a dynamic or have several dynamics. So we will describe those dynamics and also try to link it up with the literature, how those collective action dynamics can be solved in general terms and also in specific terms when we have a multi-family, multi-owned system. So perhaps I stop here for a while and see whether you have any question on that. Anything I haven't explained fully or I missed to explain something. For those who attend the lecture while Zoom, you can also turn on your microphone and speak out, or you can type it in the chat box. While you're thinking about that, so let me make two announcements. One is about the seminar meeting after this lecture. So all group would meet. So, and sorry that I haven't checked with the tutor whether they have set up a so-called Zoom link on that, because there are some students who are attending via Zoom. So I'm not quite sure whether they're at home or they're just around. So there's also the course outline. And the other thing is about paper discussion. So in week 3 and week 4, in the seminar meetings, you will have a paper discussion and you'll assign some paper, and that assignment list is already published in Canvas. But sorry, in the first edition, I messed up with the reference number. So I eventually changed that because the number doesn't match between what I announced and also in the course outline. I changed the reference number in the course outline, so I haven't changed the reference number in the list. So you make those sort of connection in the link in Canvas in doing that. Okay, anything you like to ask or you like me to follow up? Okay, if not, otherwise, see you next time, next week.即係就唔好理佢，因為我哋話明 physical 嘅，咁佢係要 physical 翻嚟。唔係，咁可能有啲喺呢度，就開住佢。但係我頭先數嗰啲度得嗰6下嚟，你差唔多120，所以我唔知其他嗰啲人係點。得。